Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Ivy, Gleeful Spellthief, a Simic Commander from Dominaria United. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed from Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including things like shipping. Anyway, Ivy, Gleeful Spellthief is a legendary 2/1 flying fairy rogue that costs a green and a blue mana to cast, and has the ability where, whenever a player casts a spell that targets only one creature, and that creature isn't Ivy, you can copy that spell and have the copy target Ivy. Which, frankly, is an ability that can go rather bonkers with a number of triggers and can make a real mess out of your board state. And that's just thinking on the spells we'll be using ourselves, since we'll be making copies of our opponent's spells as well. And I'd say this likely isn't the deck for the faint of heart, especially if you don't like missing triggers. And if you're trying to build this deck in paper, word of warning, you're probably going to want to have a bunch of slips of paper and a pen around because you're going to be making a bunch of tokens. That being said, this is a bit of a weird deck on how it plays, so let's go over what it actually aims to do. As Ivy requires the spell being cast to target a creature that isn't Ivy, we'll look to have a handful of creatures that give us benefits for targeting them with our spells to get some extra value, along with some creatures fitting in different roles so we aren't likely to only have Ivy on the board at a given time. And well, many of those creatures are also not going to be humans, as one of the main goals of this deck is to mutate those creatures and also mutate Ivy to change her card types, while also putting on additional abilities. Specifically, we're looking to get rid of her legendary super type, since once Ivy is no longer legendary, we can make clones of her without having to worry about the legend rule, as so long as the mutate creature spell is on top of Ivy, replacing her card types, as the copy of our merged Ivy would have the characteristics of the mutate card on top, but would still have Ivy's spell stealing shenanigans as an effect. Now, having a few Ivies on the board will likely do a decent amount on its own just from stealing our opponent's spells, but we'll also look to include a hefty portion of useful aura enchantments to buff our non-Ivy target creature, and any version of Ivy that we have on the board. But I think I've explained how this deck will make a complete mess out of our board state, so let's start getting into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up is some ramp based around lands, including Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth, 1-drop auras that can make a land tap for an additional mana, and Rampant Growth, which lets you tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Then we have some mana dorks, which we can mutate with Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, and Fyndhorn Elves, 1-drops that tap for green, and Sanctum Weaver adds mana of any color equal to the number of enchantments you control, of which there will be many in this deck we'll get to later. Then moving on to mana rocks, Prismatic Lens and Mind Stone will tap for generic, Sky Diamond and Moss Diamond will tap for blue and green, respectively, and Felwar Stone is likely to tap for at least one of our colors. Talisman of Curiosity taps for generic, or it can make blue or green mana at the cost of picking ourselves for 1 damage, and Arcane Signet will tap for any color we need at the time. But now, let's quickly go over a few creatures that can give us some extra benefits for targeting them with our spells. First up, we have Storm Chaser Drake, Triton Fortune Hunter, and Gnarlback Rhino, each of which have you draw a card whenever they are targeted with a spell you control. Then Spellwild Oof makes it cheaper, by 2 generic mana, for us to cast spells targeting it, and thus also Ivy. Legolas Master Archer gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you target it with a spell you cast, and Timber Paladin goes from a 1/1 to a 3/3, to a 5/5 with Vigilance, and finally to a 10/10 with Vigilance and Trample when it has 0, 1, 2, and 3 auras enchanting it, respectively. But now let's move on to our mutate spells, which we can cast as creatures themselves, but are here mostly to be cast for their mutate costs. Dreamtail Heron has you draw whenever it mutates, and Sea Dasher Octopus has you draw whenever it deals combat damage to a player. Meanwhile, Parcel Beast has an activated ability to look at the top card of your library, where, if it's a land, you can put it onto the battlefield, not requiring it to be tapped necessarily, or you put it into your hand, whether it's a land or not. And the last card advantage mutate card here is Auspicious Sterix, which has you exile cards from the top of your library until you've exiled X permanent spells, with X being the number of times this creature mutated, and those permanents are put onto the battlefield. A few things to note. The non-permanent cards that are exiled in this manner remain exiled, but also, while making copies of a mutated creature keeps all of the abilities of the merged cards, it won't keep the mutation count when copied. So for example, if the Sterix here is mutated onto Ivy so we can make a copy of Ivy, the copy of the Sterix Ivy will have a mutation count of 0, while the original would have a count of at least 1. Obviously, these copies can be mutated later to access the Sterix's ability, but it would require another mutate card. We then have a few mutate cards with interaction as their ability, with Pouncing Shore Shark bouncing a creature an opponent controls into its owner's hand when it mutates, Gem Razor destroys an opponent's artifact or enchantment when it mutates. And Sawtusk Demolisher destroys a target non-creature permanent when it mutates, though the permanent's controller gets a 3/3 beast creature token. Then, to finish off this section, Migratory Greathorn tutors a basic land onto the battlefield tapped whenever it mutates. Glowstone Recluse grows by gaining 2+1/+1 counters whenever it mutates. And Trumpeting Gnar makes a 3/3 green beast creature token for yourself when it mutates. But now that we have some creatures to target, and some mutate cards to target them and Ivy with, let's take a look at the spells that we could use to make copies of Ivy, and our other creatures if we wish. Mirage Mockery, Repudiate Replicate, and Faded Infatuation are all one-off spells that let us make a token copy of a creature we control, with Repudiate and Replicate also having, well, Repudiate if you wanted to stop an activated or triggered ability, and Faded Infatuation lets you scry if you cast it on your turn. Then Quasi-Duplicate, Cackling Counterpart, and Rally the Galadrim also make a token copy of a creature we control, but each also have a method to double up their value. Quasi-Duplicate and Cackling Counterpart have Jumpstart and Flashback, respectively, as ways to cast them from our graveyard, and Rally the Galadrim has Conspire, where you can tap 2 untapped creatures you control that share a color with that spell to make a copy of Rally the Galadrim. Then Rite of Replication simply makes a token copy of a target creature, not necessarily ours, but if it's cast with its kicker cost paid, you'll make 5 of those tokens instead. Then Followed Footsteps is an aura enchantment that makes a token copy of the enchanted creature at the beginning of your upkeeps. And finally, Vesuvan Duplimancy makes it so whenever you target a single creature or artifact you control with a spell that you're casting, it makes a non-legendary copy of that artifact or creature. But now that we have a bunch of ways of mutating and making copies of Ivy, let's go over more of our aura spells that we'll be using to buff our designated target creature and any Ivy-based creature we'll have on the board. First up, Order of Nylea puts a +1/+1 counter on its enchanted creature whenever it attacks, and is sacked when that creature has at least 3 +1/+1 counters on it, where, when sacked, you can tutor 2 basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. Ancestral Mask gives its enchanted creature +2/+2 for each other enchantment on the field. And Bear Umbra gives its enchanted creature Totem Armor for some protection, +2/+2, and it untaps all the lands you control when its enchanted creature attacks. Octopus Umbra also grants Totem Armor, while making the enchanted creature an 8/8 and letting you tap any target creature with a power 8 or less whenever the enchanted creature attacks. And Colossification gives its enchanted creature +20/+20, though at the cost of tapping said enchanted creature when Colossification enters the battlefield, so probably best to cast during your post-combat main phase. Then Crystal Carapace gives its enchanted creature +3/+3 in Ward 2, making it a bit harder for our opponents to target, while Shielding Plaques gives its enchanted creature something akin to Hexproof, as its enchanted creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. Where it differs from Hexproof is that you can target an opponent's creature, and they wouldn't be able to target it with any of their abilities since they're our opponent, even though the enchanted creature isn't ours. But we could still copy Shielding Plaques onto Ivy if we target an opponent's creature. So hopefully someone has fun shutting down a Voltron deck while still protecting Ivy with this card. But also, Curator's Ward and Alpha Authority provide the enchanted creature with Hexproof, Alpha Authority also making it so that creature can only be blocked by at most 1 creature. And finally, Aqueous Form makes its enchanted creature unblockable while letting us scry 1 whenever it attacks. Now before I move on to the next chapter, I'd like to quickly mention one card that's a bit hard to slot into any section, which is Errant, Street Artist, who A, is a human and thus can't be mutated, but B, has an activated ability that makes a copy of a targeted spell that we control that wasn't cast. And since Ivy is going to be making copies of spells left, right, and center, and copies aren't cast, we'll have plenty of opportunities between our own and our opponent's spells to use Errant's ability. But now, let's move on to some spells that we can use to interact with what our opponents are doing, and that also weren't mentioned in an earlier chapter. First up, Simic Charm has a few potential uses, either giving a target creature +3/+3 for the turn, giving our permanents Hexproof for the turn, or bouncing a target creature to its opponent's hand. And Counterspell simply lets us counter a target spell. Rapid Hybridization lets you destroy a target creature, though its controller gets a 3/3 green frog lizard creature token in return, and Beast Within destroys a target permanent, though its controller gets a 3/3 green beast creature token. Then to help us deal with some creatures en masse, Curse of the Swine is an X-cost spell that lets us exile X target creatures, though their controllers replace them with 2/2 green boar creature tokens. And Azuri's Predation is a bit of a one-sided board wipe for weenies, as you make a 4/4 green Phyrexian beast creature token for each creature your opponents control, and then each of those tokens fights a different one of those creatures, likely wiping out many of our opponent's creatures and leaving us with a few leftover Phyrexian beasts. But to protect some of our stuff, we have Tamiyo Safekeeping and Slip Out the Back, the former giving a target creature hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn, and the latter giving a target creature +1/+1 and phasing it out. And since these target a single creature, they can be copied by Ivy to stretch the spells further across our board if we're trying to mitigate the damage from, say, an opponent's board wipe. Now with that, let's go over some spells that we can use to help keep our hands filled that also weren't previously mentioned, most of these also happening to be aura enchantments. Sixth Sense, Curiosity, and Combat Research are all one-drop auras that let you draw a card when their enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player. And given Ivy has flying and is likely going to have a copy of this enchantment, you'll at least have some evasion to help you get some damage through to draw. Keen Sense is similar to the others, but it lets you draw off the creature doing any damage to an opponent, with Snake Umber doing the same, while also providing +1/+1 and totem armor. And finally, Season of Growth lets you scry 1 whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, and draw whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you control. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. First up are some land tutor lands with Shire Terrace, Promising Vein, and Myriad Landscape, all tapping for generic, while the first two can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the latter can tutor 2 basics of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then we have Yavimaya Coast, a Pain land, Fine Glimmer Snarl, a Reveal land, Temple of Mystery, a Scry land, Thornwood Falls, a life gain land, and Simic Growth Chamber, a bounce land. Then Path of Ancestry and Command Tower tap for any color in our commander's color identity. And then Mirror Pool and Lajara Mirror Lake are some additional ways to make a copy of a target creature we control, though admittedly it's a rather mana expensive route. And finally, we'll fill the rest of our deck with 12 forests and 11 islands. But with all 100 cards in this deck laid out, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing around $44.50 at the time of recording, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but again, this doesn't include things like shipping. Now before I close out this video, there's a few potential upgrades I'd like to bring up in case you'd like to build this deck with a slightly higher budget. Something like Twinning Staff can really ramp up the number of spell copies we make throughout the game. And for those of you who aren't against playing with poison counters, Venerated Rot Priest makes it so whenever one of your creatures becomes the target of a spell, you give a target opponent a poison counter. Then Helm of the Host, Irenicus's Vile Duplication, and Quantum Misalignment are some great copy spells that would let you make a copy of Ivy without having to mutate her legendary status away, as the copy from these spells isn't legendary. And you also may wish to have a bit more interaction as instants instead of as mutate spells, so things like Pongify for creature destruction, or counter spells like An Offer You Can't Refuse may be something to look into. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, maybe consider dropping a sub. With all that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.